Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. I am super excited to guide you through this one because we're going to be tackling one of the most massive, totally invisible economic forces that shapes literally our entire daily lives. Yep, we're talking about globalization. But hey, we aren't just going to sit here and look at dry theory today. We're actually grounding this in a dramatic, real-world crisis that completely shifted the trajectory of an entire nation. So buckle up because we're heading back to 1991 to an economic pivot that absolutely changed the world. Now picture this for a second. Imagine looking at your bank account right now and realizing you only have enough money left to survive for exactly 14 days. That's it, 2 weeks. Well, that was the terrifying, very real reality for the entire country of India in 1991. The nation was facing a severe, unprecedented crisis, and its foreign exchange reserves had just plummeted to critically low levels. They literally only had enough foreign currency left to pay for essential imports for 2 more weeks. It was a complete make-or-break moment of absolute desperation. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is the roadmap we're going to use to break down this complex macroeconomic beast. We'll start with that 1991 crisis. Then we'll see exactly how the economic gates swung open and look at the engines and corporations that actually drive globalization. After that, we'll wrap up with the WTO's role and take a really honest look at the true balanced costs of this massive global shift. Starting us off with part 1, the 1991 economic crisis. So as we just saw, the clock was seriously ticking, and national survival was on the line here. To avoid total default, the Indian government had no choice but to approach the World Bank and the IMF for a massive $7 billion loan. But, a lifeline of that size, it comes with a pretty dramatic catch. And that catch was the new economic policy of 1991. Basically, India had to agree to these strict international conditions, fundamentally changing how they did business. They had to remove their tight government restrictions on the private sector and completely rethink how they handled international trade. Now, what's really interesting here is how the specific DNA of this new policy breaks down. It's basically a 3-part puzzle that feeds directly into itself. First up, you have liberalisation, which put an end to the era of heavy government licensing. Second, privatization, which suddenly gave a much, much larger role to the private sector over the public sector. And all of this culminates in the third piece, globalization. That's the actual physical integration of the domestic economy with the rest of the world. Moving on to part 2, opening the economic gates. So how exactly does a previously closed-off nation physically open its doors? The contrast is honestly stark. If you look at pre-1991, the economy was highly protected. We're talking heavy, unwanted government controls, massive trade barriers everywhere, and a really strict focus on self-reliance. But post-1991, it is a completely different universe. Trade barriers are stripped away, the doors swing wide open for multinational corporations, and the nation pivots aggressively toward a free market economy driven by competitive forces. The crucial point to remember is that liberalization wasn't just some vague, high-level concept. It was a series of aggressive, tactical actions to literally invite foreign money in. They slashed tariffs, they lifted quantitative import restrictions, and they created these things called special economic zones, basically areas with world-class infrastructure and massive tax breaks, designed specifically to lure in foreign companies. They even relaxed foreign exchange controls and labor laws, eventually launching massive campaigns like Make in India to totally seal the deal. Which brings us to part 3, the engine of globalization. Now, policy changes on paper are great, but alone, they aren't quite enough. Something has to physically power this massive system. And while the removal of tax barriers and the entry of foreign companies are absolutely critical, they paired perfectly with another unstoppable force. We're talking about rapid advancements in technology. It's this specific combination right here, government deregulation meeting a total technological revolution, that threw globalization into absolute overdrive. Because the reality is, technology stimulated this process more than anything else combined. Sure, improvements in transport meant physical goods could move faster and cheaper. But the real game changer was the explosion of computers, the internet, and telecommunications. They practically erased physical borders overnight. Suddenly, a news magazine meant for readers in London could be instantly designed and printed in New Delhi. It transformed nations with highly skilled English-speaking workforces into massive global hubs for things like business process outsourcing. Next up, part 4, how MNCs connect the world. So who actually takes advantage of all this wild new technology and these wide open borders? The answer, multinational corporations, or MNCs. To really grasp the sheer scale of an MNC's operation, you have to look at the global assembly line. It's incredible. An MNC might design a brand new product at an R&D center in the United States, then have the components manufactured in China to take advantage of cheap labor. Next, they assemble those parts in Mexico or Eastern Europe so they're super close to Western markets. And finally, they handle all the customer care out of India to utilize highly skilled engineers at a fraction of the cost. This crazy global web can literally cut a company's production costs by 50 to 60%. Let's move to and see how this builds when an MNC decides to bring this kind of foreign investment into a new country. They typically execute it in three distinct ways. First, through joint ventures. That's partnering with a local company to share new money and tech. Second, and honestly the most common, is taking over, just using their massive wealth to simply buy out the local competition entirely. And third, placing orders. This is where they buy goods like garments from thousands of small global producers and then just slap their own massive brand name on the final product. Moving right along to Part 5, the WTO and free trade. With all this crazy global movement of money and goods happening, you might be wondering who makes the rules. Enter the World Trade Organization, or WTO. Established in 1995 and headquartered in Geneva, its 164 member countries essentially use it as a global referee. The WTO's primary objective is to promote multilateral trade, eliminate those pesky tariffs, ensure trade flows as smoothly as possible, and settle all those thorny international trade disputes. However, the source material we're looking at points out a very, very important distinction between the WTO in theory and the WTO in practice. In theory, the WTO aims to promote free trade so that every single member benefits uniformly. Sounds great, right? But in practice, the analysis notes that the playing field often remains pretty tilted. The text highlights instances where developed countries have unfairly retained their own trade barriers, heavily subsidizing their own farmers, for example, while at the exact same time using WTO rules to force developing nations to remove their barriers. It's a highly complex dynamic that shows free trade isn't always fair trade. And finally, Part 6, the true cost of globalization. Okay, it's time to zoom out. Let's evaluate the real-world results of this 1991 pivot by looking at both the massive wins and the devastating losses, completely impartially. On the financial side, the win is honestly staggering. Check this out. In 1990-91, foreign direct investment was just around $100 million. Fast forward to 2020-21, and that number has skyrocketed to $76 billion. That is an almost unimaginable influx of money, technology, and corporate presence pouring right into the domestic economy. But a truly balanced look requires us to see both sides of the ledger here. On the positive side, GDP growth jumped massively, hitting 8.2%. The IT and service sectors completely boomed, creating countless new jobs. And consumers today enjoy immense choices and way lower prices due to fierce market competition. But on the negative side, small domestic producers have often been entirely crushed, totally unable to withstand the sheer might of giant MNCs. Plus, this economic growth has been highly concentrated in urban areas and services, pretty much completely bypassing the agricultural sector, which provides livelihoods for millions of people. As a direct result, the disparity between the rich and the poor and between rural and urban areas is widening fast. So this leaves us with a pretty stark dual reality. On one hand, globalization has absolutely made the country an incredibly attractive investment hub and modernized the economy in ways people couldn't have dreamed of in 1991. But it's also clear from the source text that the system heavily favors richer nations who already dominate world trade. And locally, the immense benefits have largely been captured by those who already possess education, skill, and wealth. And that brings us to our final thought for today. The source leaves us with a really critical challenge: the struggle for fair globalization. We've seen just how powerful opening an economy can be, transforming a terrifying 2-week surviving crisis into a multi-billion-dollar tech and service powerhouse. But as we reflect on this explainer, the lingering question is this: how do we ensure these incredible benefits are actually shared by everyone? What government policies are necessary to protect all people, not just the highly skilled, in an increasingly connected world? It's a deeply complex question, for sure, but understanding the actual mechanics we've covered today is the first crucial step to answering it. Thank you so much for joining me, and keep exploring.